Imagine living in the harsh, cold weather of BC. Imagine not knowing where your next meal would come from. Imagine not having a roof over your head. Homelessness isn't an issue that just affects third world countries, but also developed countries like Canada.
Homelessness refers to the situation in which one does not have stable, permanent, and/or appropriate housing.
Did you know that 20% of BC's population is homeless? And in February 2017, it was estimated that there were 4,000 people homeless in Greater Vancouver.
Currently, the government's answer to homelessness are temporary halfway houses. These houses are similar to the ones you and I live in, but house about 5 to 10 men or women who are struggling with the issue of homelessness and sometimes addictions or other issues.
Before we go into more details of halfway houses, let's take a look at the history of homelessness. Being homeless before the 1960s usually applied to men with no family ties, usually those who were transient migrant workers living in very poor housing.
The poor were sheltered in Skid Row housing found in the less desirable parts of a city. Skid Row housing seemed awfully familiar to halfway housing. They were single-family homes where each room was rented out to someone at a low cost.
Halfway houses and Skid Row are very similar to one another. The only difference is that the government pays for halfway houses.
We started to question the current government's solutions to homelessness and wondered why the 1960s definition of homelessness is now the 21st century government's answer. Aren't people living in halfway houses still technically homeless?
You may argue that the 60s definition is no longer valid, but that still doesn't mean that halfway houses are the answer to the problem.
As mentioned before, halfway houses are a place where several formerly homeless people live under one roof. These people are happy to finally be off the streets and have a roof over their head, but there's a lot more negative energy and problems, as many of them are battling drug addictions and mental illnesses.
The purpose of these homes is to give people an address in order to obtain a job to support themselves and get back on their feet. The problem is, being surrounded by negative people and a negative environment, your state is less likely to change, which is why many people choose not to live in halfway houses. Homelessness isn't just an unfortunate occurrence. Many human rights are being violated, such as access to housing and right to safety and security. Those who are homeless are also denied access to basic services such as water, sanitation, and food.
Let's take a look at how Finland dealt with the issue of homelessness. Finland happens to be the only country in the EU that is not currently in a homeless crisis.
So how did they do it? Well, they used a strategy known as housing first. Housing first is the answer to homelessness by giving people quality permanent housing instead of just managing it with emergency shelters and hostels. Housing First gives those who are affected by homelessness a place to live immediately after the situation arises, instead of waiting for the situation to get worse. In this method, everyone gets an independent rental flat so they can be self-sufficient.
Being self-sufficient also refers to being able to support yourself financially. Housing First ensures everyone eligible can sustain themselves by paying 30% of their income to rent and paying for their own food, taxes, and other services. If needed, Housing First is available to support them in paying some bills. Lastly, Housing First makes sure that there is a tenant-landlord relationship, which is important to being an independent. Now that we have provided some background info, let us get into what we can do to change the crisis of homelessness in BC.
We got many concerned citizens to sign a petition urging the government to commit to ending the homelessness epidemic in BC, and we plan on sending it to Premier John Horgan, the Minister of Social Development Shane Simpson, and Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing Selena Robinson. Currently, Housing First has been adopted by several Canadian communities and has proven to be successful, which is why we think it can work in BC as well. It also costs less to keep somebody off the street than it is to slowly help them through the process of getting back on their feet.
Think of all the little things we take for granted: clean clothing, education, nutritious food, transportation, cell phones, heat, and a roof over our head. Many people in our community do not have the same things we take for granted. Homelessness is an unnecessary part of our province, and we need to take action now.